Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we are doing chapter 103 of Breaking Step. The nearly black knife floated between Tibbs's hand. He didn't need them there like they nestled the etching, but he found it comfortable to have a visual limitation to how much to how the essence moved. Corruption doesn't flow, Dawn explained, once they were seated inside the room above the corruption pool, the way water does. Tibbs had been concerned his friend would get in trouble for using it without asking permission this time, but so long as no one needed it, he'd explained, no one cared. He'd looked at Tibbs and added, so long as it's still there by the time we leave. He raised a hand as Tibbs started to correct him that watered essence didn't flow. I know it isn't the right word. Believe me, any scholar who researches essence knows it's never the right word. Half the books I read spend more time arguing over which is the word that should be used instead of explaining the research. For the purpose of this session, water flows and corruption oozes. Tibbs nodded and Don continued. Unlike water, corruption doesn't have a condition in which it can be solid. It goes from oozing to drifting to floating. Simply put, you can make corruption less solid with will, but not more. For that, you need an assembly starting with Ike, which, wait, won't Ike make the etching fly apart? The Arcanus is about movement. It's what happened when the lance I made just flew out of my control. As your teacher explained how not every Arcanus interacts with the element the same way? It has come up, Tib said, remembering the headache that had caused not only did that had caused. Not only did the Arcanus not always act the same from one element to the other, but the same Arcanus could have a variety of behavior depending on what element it was with. As well, wait, not only they're not from one element to another, but okay, this is basically a repeat. But the same Arcanus could have a variety of behavior depending on what element it was with. Okay. You can have a variety of behavior depending on what the other Arcanus were used in the filigree. In that case, Ike does add motion to the essence, then form the box of corruption, which drooped as soon as it existed. Tibbs sensed the sorcerer adding a filigree of Ike, spaced well apart, and the drooping stopped. As you can sense, the essence is moving, and that motion is letting the form I will it in remain. He was right. There was a vibration in the essence now, but instead of making the box fly out of Dawn's control, it went in all direction at the same time and caused it to be solid. What Ike is doing is getting stronger, Tibbs said, sensing the vibration increase. Indeed, it's why Ike can't be used on its own. The box exploded in a formless cloud of essence that Dawn absorbed. The Arcanus builds constantly, adding more and more stress on the essence lattice. You can compensate by adding more lattices, but that's a losing battle. Ike will always overcome them. It's simply a question of time. You need to use another Arcanus to buffer its effect. Which one and how you place it will depend on the effect you are looking for. He looked at it expectantly, and he'd had no choice but to describe what he needed, since learning about all the ways to make corruption essence work would take more time, more than this after than this. Then the rest of this day. He needed it as hard as metal, he'd explain, aiming to keep the description vague. The etching then needed to be able to have other essences wrapped around it without them interacting, because they'd have their own filigree. And Dawn set forth with explaining what Tibs needed to do. Ka was needed on each side of Ike because it could absorb some of the motion it created. How close would depend on the exact solidity Tibs was aiming to create. Sa was then needed on the flow side, only Tibs had to ask for an explanation of the flow side, and Don demonstrated by pushing the essence from himself into the etching with a filigree. The direction the essence flowed was the flow side, and it would serve to balance the constant growth of the movement since over time Ike could overwhelm Ka just like it did the etching lattice. All was needed on either side, as well as any crossing of filigree, so he had control over what went where. Again, Tibs would have to experiment with positioning. Don smiled. But starting here and going with only with incremental change will keep you from causing this to explode. The smile vanished. Well, it should. Please don't prove me wrong. Then he had started with the other filigree Tibs would need to account for him adding essences and changing their effect. Whenever Tibs asked for clarification, Don answered. When Tibs asked about something relating to the element or the essence or the arcanist that didn't impact what he was teaching, he shut down the inquiry. When Don had gone off on a tangent about how even something as mindset when it was even as much when a lattice was built, when Don had gone off on a tangent about how even something as mindset when a lattice was built affected how a filigree behaved, and how some scholar okay, yeah, so if I used filigree here, then it's built affected how it behaved, and how some scholar theorized that that was why the classes had to be created to capitalize on and focus the similar mindset, which led to the creation of the fighters, sorcerers, rogues, and archers, since okay, archers should not be capitalized. Since even back then, purity as a group was a group of its own. Clerics were never studied. Purity was a group on because since even back then, purity was a group of its own. Clerics were never studied, but observation were supported. Have supported those theories. Tibs had started to tell him about how clerics might work with their essence because of their connection to the element, but the sorceress stopped him, been annoyed at himself for going off topic, and set back to teaching Tibs. The correction center of his building etching was unchanging. Letting there be much more than he could normally push together through willing it. So he set about adding the next layer. Darkness to increase it to increase the chances his weapon would be undetected, since Tibs didn't have the time to practice making it until it happened. To decrease the chances his weapon would be detected. Since Tibs didn't have the time to practice etching it until he could make it with barely any thoughts. All right, let's see if that still feel like a pretty large, but let's see. So he said about adding the next layer. Darkness to decrease the chances his weapon to decrease the chance his weapon would be detected, since Tibbs didn't have the time to practice etching it until he could make it with barely any thoughts. No, not too bad. He'd have to make it ahead of time. Oh, okay. All right. Let's change that around. Since Tibbs didn't have the time to practice making it until etching it until he could make it with barely a thought, he'd have to make it ahead of time. And walk about the guild with it. He set it into the filigree he used for this darkness sheath, making alteration to ensure he wouldn't it. What the hell? All right. He set about he set into it the filigree he used for his darkness sheath, making alteration to ensure that, okay, that's definitely it, wouldn't be affected. What? What the bleep? He set a filigree like the one um, similar to the one for his darkness sheath, altering it. Altering it. And yes, I am making this up on the fly because I have no idea. Um, and even now, I don't. Okay, you know what? I am not gonna bother. Like, this is not important, and I can't figure out what I meant. Alrighty, save time and walk about the guild with it. Then metal essence with a filigree to strengthen it for thrusting, and one to sharpen the edge until it might be able to slice through weaves, if that was a thing. Then a final edge of corruption to ensure it would cut through whatever protection Marger had. That gave him a blade. Now he had to work on the pommel if he wanted to be able to wield it with more than his will. Tibbs woke and immediately set about forming the knife, and he needed too many tries. He sat at the table and set about practicing. In a hurry, Khrushchev asked, placing a new tankard and taking the empty one. Tibbs' plate was almost empty. What's to do? He was down to 6 tries before the etching was proper. Still too many. He wanted to get it right on the first try, since that would let him etch it as close to the last moment as possible. But he expected that wasn't as close to the last as needed. But he expected that wasn't possible in the time he had left. So he wanted to make it as close to reaching the guild as but he expected that wasn't possible in the time he had left. He wanted to make it as close. Oh, all right. Um, yeah, he wanted to make it before reaching the before reaching the guild, so there would be as few distractions as possible once it was made. Does one of those things include visiting Jackal? The reproach in the server's eyes kept Tibs from protesting. He was too busy. He nodded in a hurry to finish his plate before racing to the stairs. He knocked on the door, then cracked it open. Khrushchev should still be working, but Tibs had lost sight of him, so he wanted to be sure they weren't setting him up to see something he had no interest in. Even waiting to be invited in wasn't a guarantee he wouldn't get an eyeful, and Jackal on his own didn't mean he wouldn't find a way to tease Tibs. The room was quiet, and Jackal was reclined on the bed, his lower half covered with a sheet, hands on top of that. The Jackal gave him a weak smile as Tibs stepped in. Come to see your dying leader? He forced a cough. I thought you'd already moved on. Been busy, Tibs mumbled, pulling his chair next to the bed. He knew Jackal was jesting. Tibs had forgotten about him being sick in the middle of getting ready. But Tibs had forgotten about him in the middle of being sick in the middle of getting ready. And you weren't dying. Jackal forced another cough. How can you say that? I've been wasting away in this bed. Soon there'll be nothing left of me. I can sense what's left of corruption in your essence, Tibs said, rolling his eyes. You could get out of the bed if you really... Jackal had a hand on Tibs's mouth, looking at the door fearfully. Don't say that, he whispered. Crow might hear you, and then he'll stop looking after me. Tibs leveled a look on the fighter as he moved the hand away. Your man is never going to stop looking after you, and even when you're healthy. And if you start telling me about the special stuff he does when you're sick, Tibs added as Jackal opened his mouth, I'm going to fill you with so much corruption, it's going to shrivel down into nothing. I doubt there's enough corruption to make that happen, the fighter replied with a smirk. I've seen it, remember? I know exactly how much it'll take. If you didn't want me to know that, you shouldn't have arranged for me to walk in on your fun like you did. You make it sound like I knew when you'd return to our room. Jackal said, grinning. Oh, you have your ways of knowing. Jackal let himself fall back on the bed. What's keeping you busy? Tib shrugged, and the fighter frowned. If I threaten to tie you to that chair so you have to watch me and Crow have fun, will you tell me? I'd rather you didn't. That's why threats work. Tibs glared at the Jackal, and the smile went away. He had simply forgotten, but Jackal knew him too well. He'd work through any excuse Tibs gave him and come to something close to the truth, and that was too dangerous for his friend. If you don't want to tell me, Tibs, it means you probably shouldn't be doing it. It has to be done. Jackal sighed. I hate it when you say that, because coming from you, it's probably true. Tell me you're going to be careful. As much as I can, I'm working on making sure it goes right. Good, because we've already missed one run. I will be better before the next one, and I need my rogue if we're going to clear the 4th floor. Tibs nodded. He didn't know what would happen to the runs with the guild destroyed, but he was sure he'd manage to get them in the dungeon, no matter what. Then I should let you go. Any longer, and Crow's going to wonder what I'm up to. He's going to wonder if I'm up to no good. When are you ever not? Jackal stared at him. Are you saying he already knows? Tibs shrugged, and his friend's expression turned suspicion. Okay. Exactly what is my man up to? Tibs snorted. How about enjoying not having to you running around the town, getting in fights and staying out until the late hours, drinking with unmentionable people? Hey, I mention if I'm asked. Jekyll's smile vanished. Tibs, be careful. I am. He stood and left. The problem wasn't maintaining the darkness sheath and his corruption knife at the same time. The problem came from the one detail he'd forgotten in his hurry to train both. People didn't see him. Yes, they noticed something if they caught sight of him out of the corner of their eye, but those weren't the problem. It was the town folks looking ahead of them as they walked, looking directly at Tibs, if they happened to be heading for each other. With him focused on maintaining the two etching more than once, he'd nearly bumped into someone and the jerk to avoid the collision caused his focus to break. Then his sudden appearance caused enough of a ruckus. He decided that the sheath came first. They couldn't afford for word of him appearing out of nowhere to reach the guild. Now, after a few days of splitting his attention three ways, the sheath first, remaining aware of the people around him second, and then the knife, the split. Okay. Okay. Now the problem is that because now after means there should be a consequence of it. Like this is an if a variation on the if then statement. I need now after not and keep track everyone around. All right. Well, he was able to walk around and keep track of everyone around him. The split meant he couldn't keep some of the essence from leaking away. But it wasn't enough to keep him from going through with this. If he could find a way to get in, he'd approach the guild sheathed to get a sense of the weave's reaction, looking to work out a way to defeat it, but it was beyond his ability. And he needed a way in soon. From listening to the clerks, Marger was close to being done. It was all they could talk about, guessing on what he would do. Who would replace Tirania? Would the runners be sent to other dungeons while he restarted everything here from scratch? Yeah. None of them had given time frames, but the sense of any day now was there. Breathing the urgency away so he remained careful became harder with each failure at thinking of a way in. He didn't want to succeed just to end up dead. He wasn't abandoning his team like that. He stepped out of the crowd to alleviate some of the mental strain and leaned against the wall. He maintained his sheath and knife, although it wasn't a sheath at his belt, the one that had contained the sword that had crumbled away with the golem holding it. Without having to remain aware of the crowd, the two etchings hardly taxed him. Not having to focus so much also let him notice the dog sniffing the ground between where he'd been in the crowd and the wall. It was one of Serba's larger dogs. It sniffed at him at his feet, then searched away. Letting out a whine, it sniffed back and forth before him, stopped again, looked at him, then away, before sniffing the ground some more. Tibs looked around. This wasn't one of her dogs that sometimes wandered away from her. She'd set him on this search, so she would be. He found her on the other side of the crowd. Some essence at the mouth of an alley with dogs at her feet. Then he saw her in the gaps between people. Sorry, he told the dog, then entered an alley to go around. The sniffing followed him, the dog nose to the ground, a few steps behind him. When he reached where she stood, she wasn't there. He found her by the crowd parting to let her and her dogs return from the other side of the road. He stepped deeper into the alley, the dog following him, and dropped the sheath. The dog let out a startled whine, looked at him, and let out a bark, sitting. He released the knife. Then Serba was in the mouth of the alley, glaring at him. About time, she said. Just where have you been hiding any longer, and I wouldn't have been able to warn you in time. In time for what? For you to move your stuff before the commander raids it. How did Adrian find out this time? Tibs asked in exasperation. He so didn't have time to deal with this. I don't know, but he's been gathering people all morning. He rubbed the temple. Who did he have available he could send? He had no idea. Keeping track of his rogues was another thing he'd let go to train. It was probably how Erdian had learned about it. Someone had taken Tibbs's lack of oversight as their cue to push for their plot forward, and he sighed. What was the point? So he'd lose. So he'd lose the equipment for a few days. Once the guild was no more, he'd get it back from the rubble. Of course, that was if he could find a way in without being noticed, which was looking less and less likely with Marjor's departure growing ever closer. He straightened, staring at Serba, who took a step back, hands up placatingly. When is the raid happening? He asked as she kept retreating. Why did he keep thinking he needed to get in on his own? She hesitated. At this point, just about now? She turned and ran as if her life depended on it, her dogs trailing behind. Tibs ran because the future of his town depended on it. And that concludes chapter 103 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter is going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read this story as well as the other two in the series, they are up on Royal Road for free. If you want to read ahead of Royal Road and support me in the process, that is on my Patreon. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.